That's Wednesday starting at 6 o'clock. I'm going to invite Pastor Ryan up here. He's going to continue us in our series, Own the Vision. Love you guys.
Well, thank you, Heather. Great to be with all of you this morning. As she mentioned, my name is Ryan. I'm the lead pastor here, and a special welcome to those of you who may be new this morning, either here in person or joining us online. This past week, I had the privilege of meeting with someone, a retired pastor from the Denver area, and I'd never met this gentleman, nor had I ever heard of him prior to our call. We were simply paired up by our denomination, which we belong to, the Covenant Church, as a way of retired pastors or pastors who are a lot further down the road than maybe even I am, to provide support and encouragement to pastors like myself. And, you know, the Zoom call, it started pretty typical. We'd never met each other, so I gave him nutshell versions of my faith and my family and my ministry, and it was followed by my hope for what I hoped that this meeting him would turn into, what my hope would be for future meetings. My expectation was that, you know, he'd give me some pointers. He'd tell me, like, hey, you know what, you're 42 years old, and that's a long time. You know, you got a lot left of ministry, and here's what you need to do. And so, you know, I got my notepad out. I was ready to take some notes and on best practices, maybe some books he wanted to me to read, but none of those topics ever came up. It was a meeting like I did not expect. I did not expect the meeting to go in the way that it actually did. Instead, he started asking me questions like, well, just tell me what it was like growing up. So I did. And he asked me, like, what are your greatest struggles today? Not like things you struggle with your whole life, but your greatest struggles today. He focused on things like what I was feeling in the moment and what was giving me anxiety. We talked about parenting and bad habits and dark moments in our histories. And within 30 minutes, I found myself telling him things that I've only told my wife before. And then he focused in on something I rarely, if ever, take notice in my own life. He zeroed in on something that has been gnawing at me, I think, probably for most of my life, at least for decades, something that has driven me to do what I have done and to become what I have been. He pointed out something that has ruled over me for so long, I hardly recognize it most of the time. And immediately, my eyes were sort of open and my heart broke. And it wasn't a breaking like in a destructive manner. Mind you, this is all within like 45 minutes. This is some sort of like Jedi Christian pastor that I was talking with, right? It was like my heart broke, not in a destructive manner, but in a transformational manner. My heart broke at the thought that there was this something in me that was holding me back. It had been holding me back for so long, but that there was also hope for something greater. And as I reminisced about this meeting and got off the call, and I was like, what just happened? I don't know if this guy's going to like turn me in or something like that. I don't know what I just told this guy. I realized, look, there's something in me that is broken, that needs healing. And then I got to thinking about you, and I realized that something is in you as well. And here's the thing, it's not apparent. It's often unseen, but it's there. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, he's talking about sin, but I'm actually not talking about sin. I mean, sin is an ever-present problem for us. It is. It exists in and around us all the time. And for the most part, here's the thing about sin. For the most part, if you're self-aware enough, you know your sin. You could point it out. Like, you could probably sit down right now and be like, here's some ways in which I fell short of God's glorious standard this past week. That's not what I'm talking about. There's this something else that is as equally present and as equally harmful to who you are that we have a very hard time noticing. And in many cases, it is equally as powerful as keeping God out of the picture as sin is. And here's what I've discovered, that it can also be a driving force in your life, one that promises a lot, but delivers a little. And it's 5 letters long. S-H-A-M-E. Shame. Shame. You see, in addition to temptation, Satan's most powerful tool in keeping you from God is shame. Satan is an expert at luring you into doing something you know is wrong and then turning around and pointing fingers at you to make sure you know it was wrong. The book of Revelation uses a word to describe Satan that I think is most appropriate when talking about this. And by the way, you can follow along with everything I'm going to cover here in YouVersion, so make sure you open that up. But in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, it says this of Satan. It says, "For the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down to earth, the one who accuses them before our God day and night." This is what I call the double-edged sword of sin. Okay? On the one side is temptation, that thing that sort of lures us in to doing the things that we know are against God's will for our lives. But on the other side of this sword is shame. You know what it is, right? You sin, and it's immediately followed by accusations. Not necessarily conviction, right? That's not a bad thing. Conviction's not a bad thing where you go, oh my gosh, that was not a good thing. But accusations. You hear the voice in your head saying, how could you do something so stupid? What were you even thinking? Can you even imagine how much trouble you're in right now? God clearly is upset with you because of what you just did. The accuser, Satan, he tempts us, but then he accuses us for what we just did, bringing about heaping on shame upon shame upon shame. And you cycle through this pattern of temptation, sin, and shame. You do that enough, and pretty soon your shame turns into God doesn't love you. You don't measure up in this world. You're a failure. You are so far gone. You don't matter. God doesn't look upon you with joy. He looks upon you with hatred. You allow that cycle to go on long enough in your life, and the shame that you build up in your life will paint an inaccurate picture of not only who God is, but who you are in reference to God. You live in long enough, and it will become a driving force for your life. You have no choice. In fact, for most, life is lived from a place of shame. You present yourself in a certain way, right? The way you dress, the hair you style, because you've learned that if you're not beautiful enough, you'll become an outsider. You have experienced enough shame in your life about your appearance that you do whatever you can to make sure you look appropriate so that you're not considered an outsider but belong. You behave a certain way because doing the opposite may draw attention and even criticism to you. And so your shame of criticism from past, it drives you to do certain things and to become certain things so that you don't have to experience it or deal with it. You pretend you have it all together, right? Buttoned up, because you're afraid people will really know you're just as messy, if not more, than everyone else. And shame drives you to try to be something you never were created to be. You refuse to tell someone about your sin and shame in your life because you're convinced that you'll only be judged and that they'll leave you. Here, this is how just sort of intertwined and messed up this becomes. You have shame, you have sin, and you desire to want to say it, but the shame in your life keeps you from doing it because you're afraid that people will leave you. And you live in this cycle long enough, and your life becomes driven by shame. Everything you do is shame-based, when all you really want is to just be released from it. You know, in my own life, shame, it often drives my desire to perform and be liked. I like it when you like me. I don't like it when people don't like me, right? I like to know that, hey, I did a good job and people recognize that and I sort of performed well. But the driving force behind that is not a desire to do well necessarily. It's shame because I've had experiences over my life where I didn't do well or I wasn't liked, and I never want that to happen again. And so I allow the shame in my life to drive who I am and what I do. And experiences of my past, they've taught me that in order to be considered good enough, I need to make sure I perform well enough. In my work, in my relationships, in my family, even in my relationship with God. And I'm going to tell you right now, it is exhausting. There is nothing I have found in my life more tiring than living from a place of shame. You know, my hour-long conversation with this guy from Denver revealed to me that more often than I would like to admit, I am living from a place of shame. And it's contributing to all sorts of problems in my life, but it's exhausting me. And so right now, I just want you to examine your own life. Is shame driving you? Is the shame of your past or your sin or your experiences causing you to live in such a way you feel depleted and exhausted? Do you feel a pressure to be this thing or to be that thing out of fear of simply what others might think of you? And as you think of those things, I want you to shift your attention from the shame that exists in your life, which often goes unseen, unnoticed, is given very little attention in your life. I want you to change your perspective. I want you to turn your attention from it to its antidote. Because there is one thing that exposes shame for what it is and heals us in ways we didn't expect. And it's God's grace. I want you to turn your attention from shame to God's grace. The antidote for our shame, listen, it's not self-discovery or harder work or proving yourself. The ultimate antidote for the shame that is driving our decisions in our life is God's grace. Where shame says, you're not good enough, God's grace says, you're righteous in my eyes. Where shame says, you have so much more to prove, God says, Jesus already proved it. Where shame says, you're not worthy of love, God says, I love you without condition. If we want to escape, if we want to break free of the shame that is holding us back, driving us in our lives, we have to focus our attention on one thing, God's grace. God's grace. Only by God's grace are we led to a place of forgiveness, healing, and shame-free living. Romans chapter 2, verse 4, Paul writes this. He says, don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness, often translated also grace, is intended to turn you from your sin? Can't you see how kind and patient and tolerant God is? How much he loves you, that he doesn't desire for you to live a life based in shame, but a life based and founded on grace? Now, before I move on, I believe that some of you just need to hear this today. This is all you need to hear today. You have lived under the power of shame for far too long. And you need to hear that God's grace is fully available to you. And no matter what your shame might say, no matter what the accuser might say in your life, there is nothing that you can do to earn it. It is simply a free gift to you. It is fully available to you right here and right now. Not because of what you did, not because you somehow made yourself into this great person, but simply because of who Jesus is, that he would come and live and die and resurrect 3 days later to give us the opportunity to simply grab hold of the grace that God has for us, to break free of the shame that it holds us back, and to allow his grace to be the driving force in our life. Some of you just need to hear that and rest in that and think about that this morning. And I want you to just live there for the next 20 minutes. Just sit there in God's grace this morning. And for the rest of us, I want to talk about the church. I want to talk about the church. Because not only will we allow our shame to drive our lives, but then we will turn and we will often allow it to drive the lives of others. Shame is a powerful tool for us just as much as it is for Satan. We can shame people into doing what we want, giving what we need, and behaving how we wish. It's a powerful tool. For many, their experience of church is exactly this. Searching for grace and love, they find only shame. But if sin and shame is conquered by God's grace through Jesus, then what does that mean for us, the church? I mean, we're talking about the vision that God has for our church. This has to be somehow a part of that. And I think the author of Hebrews does a good job of explaining it. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, he says, "Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God." Look after each other. Keep your eyes peeled so that nobody that you come into contact with within this community and without fails to receive the grace of God. There's some ownership in that, is there not? You see, the church, the author of Hebrews is saying that the church, the people of God, should be the place where God's grace is known and given. We should be the hub of God's grace to be known and given. Only in the church are people able to hear about and experience the grace of God through Jesus Christ. And I don't just mean a building. I mean through the people of God, the church, the community. And if we are a people of grace, driven by grace, well then it seems right that the natural outpouring of that should be the creation of a place of grace for others to come. Right? You know, Jesus, he tells this parable that I think helps explain not only God's desire for us, but like the true intensity that God desires for the church to be a place of grace. And so I'm going to turn your attention to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to read this parable that Jesus gives. And he starts by saying this, "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven," right? The kingdom of heaven, which is this place that God is establishing on earth. In the midst of sin, Jesus comes to establish the kingdom of heaven that begins now and goes on forever and ever. And if you come to faith in Jesus Christ, you are now members of that new kingdom. Jesus is your king. You are part of this community, and he is establishing it on earth. And so he's saying, look, the kingdom of heaven, it looks like this. Right now, it looks like this. He says it can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, "Please be patient with me, and I'll pay it all." Then the master was filled with pity for him, and he released him, and he forgave his debt. So Jesus begins this parable with the king's grace. Right? He has pity for him. He feels bad for him. And so out of kindness, out of grace, he releases him. He forgives him his debt. And like, this is not just some little tiny debt. The Bible says he owes millions, which, you know, in our day and age, millions, whatever equates to millions, right, would be like, that's a lot, but you might be able to do it. In the first century, This is a debt this man cannot pay. There is no like, here, have this, take my wife, take my kids, everything I got. Nothing is going to cover the amount of debt this man owes the king. He'll never earn enough money in his lifetime to do it. And so instead of the king placing shame on him, right, for his debt, forcing him to pay it back, the king shows grace and he releases him. He forgives him without question, without condition of his debt. This is God's interaction with us, okay? Jesus is saying, look, this is what happens with God with us. We have this debt that we cannot pay, right? Our sin, our rebellion against God, all the things that we've done in our life that go against God's will, we cannot pay that back. There's no paying it back. And yet, out of God's grace, through Jesus, he forgives us. He releases us from that. He doesn't pour shame on us. He pours grace on us. He sends grace for us through Jesus, forgiving our debt and giving us new life. What I want to point out, that's some of you need to live there right now, is what happens next, right? Some of you know this parable. You know what's coming. It's not good. It's not good. Here we go, verse 28. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I'll pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor, the man who was just forgiven of his millions, he wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested, put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset, rightly so. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. So, to recap, the same guy who is, forgiven, given grace for this debt that he never could pay, heaps shame on the guy who only owes him a little. Right? Instead of extending the same grace to that man, he heaps shame on him. He throws him in prison and he says, no, you can be free when you pay me. Right? Well, the king isn't really happy about this news, and so Jesus goes on in verse 32. It says, then the king called in the man who had forgiven, and he said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. And that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Now, listen, I know this story is not about any of us, right? But let's just pretend for a minute that it is. I know none of you, some of you are catching on to my sarcasm. Come on, the rest of you get there, right? Jesus is telling us how foolish it would be for someone to receive incredible grace from God and then be unwilling to share the same grace with others. How foolish. And notice, the king doesn't get angry that the man owes him a debt, right? Like the king has pity on him. He's like, look, I'm a benevolent king, and I love you. And out of grace, I forgive you. I give you new life. That's the gospel. What the king gets angry about is when the man then turns around and he does the opposite. How dare him receive such grace from God and then not extend and share it to someone else? Right? Jesus is telling us how foolish it would be for someone to receive this grace from God and then not share it with others. He's essentially saying, don't ever get to the place where you believe that God's grace is only for you. It's not just for you. It's for all people. Paul says it like this in Ephesians 2. God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we've done, so none of us can boast about it. You can't take credit for this. This is not just for you. This is for all people. And the grace of God that lives in us who have believed, who have given our lives to follow Jesus, should be outpoured, should be extended, should be shared with those in our lives. God's grace is a gift. It is not to be held hostage and to become boastful about, but to be shared and extended to others. In Jesus' parable, here's what we learn. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. God's grace for us activates our grace for others. God's grace for you is activating your grace for others. Look, you may be the only person that somebody sees God's grace in. And if we have overcome our shame because of God's grace, well, then we should be a place of grace for others. Klein Snodgrass, he says, grace is a power that energizes and has effect. God's grace is not this passive thing that we receive and then it just sits there. It is active, it energizes, it transforms, it changes who we are. When we realize the depth of God's love and kindness for us, it causes us to want to be grace dispensers in the world. God's grace to us should be the driving force in our life, not shame. Shame should be left in its wake, and as it is, the same grace should be activated in our lives to be extended to others, especially in the context of the church. We want to be a place of grace at Genesis. When your friends come, or if you've just come, you've never been here before, my hope is that you'll walk out of here going, look, maybe I don't ever understand everything that guy up there said, but I know one thing, that God's grace is for me. It's for me. And that the shame that I have lived with my whole life is able to be broken free because of God's grace. The last thing we want is someone who is burdened by shame to walk out of here feeling just as much, if not more shame than they came in with. And if you walked in here bearing the burden of shame, I hope you are right now getting to know the depth of God's grace for you. This is a place of grace. Look, you have done things. You have been places. You have broken relationships. I'm a mess. You're a mess. The last thing I want to do is come into this church feeling like I need to, ignite the shame in my life so that somehow you think that I am better than I actually am. I want my life to be put on display God's grace for my life. And I want the same for you. You see, our world doesn't need one more ounce of shame. You can get plenty of it just by walking around. Our world needs a place and a people where shame is exchanged for God's grace. Where grace, it's not just a theory, it's not just a word, it's not just a dream, but it is a reality that we live in, that we are driven by. And it begins right here, among us, this small little church right here on 32nd and Thunderbird, Genesis Church, creating a place where others experience the same grace that we have experienced among ourselves. Becoming a place of grace begins with, listen, Jesus says it in John chapter 13. Here's where it begins. He says, so now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples, that you are my followers. Love each other in the way that I've loved you. Extend grace to one another. May this be a place where shame is broken, where the accuser no longer is able to point fingers at people, but instead God's grace invades the hearts and the minds of people who have new life and new freedom and new joy in who Jesus Christ is. May that be the place that we create on this earth. I never want my legacy or your legacy or Genesis' legacy to be a place where people came and they walked out and they went, man, I feel worse for coming here than if I did not. But instead that people would come in here and they would experience the presence of God's grace, not just in Him, but in His people. So let me ask you two questions. For those of you who have been just sitting in the truth that God's grace is available for you, I want to ask you the question, will you simply receive God's grace this morning? The shame you've been living under your whole life, it has nothing against the grace of God. Paul says that we're saved by grace. It's a free gift from God. You don't have to do anything to earn it. Jesus already did it for you. You just simply have to receive it. Believing who Jesus is, what He came, what He did. And let me just say that maybe something you do for the first time today, this may be something you do for the first time today. This may be something you do for the 1,000th time today. Where you say, I've been living under this blanket of shame and I need God's grace again today. Sin and shame dominate our world and cause us to lose sight of the beauty and the rest that exists in God's grace. And sometimes we just need to turn back and say, God, I need your grace again today. The second question I want to ask is, will you share God's grace? Maybe more than ever in recent history, our world needs a people, a community, a place of grace. People are burdened with so much shame for who they are and for who they aren't, for what they do, for what they don't do. Will we be a place for them where they can experience grace, God's grace in and through us as well as Him? Will we welcome and love and have grace for those who are desperate for it? Will we become a people whose hearts and minds are in line with who God is? And so much so that the natural outpouring of our hearts and our lives is grace. Will we become those people? Will we be known for our love and grace in a world of hate and shame? Will we cultivate a place that invites people to experience the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 11, 28? And here's what Jesus says to all people. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, all of you who have been walking around being accused by Satan, living in sin and shame, burdened by the weight and the just turmoil that it has brought you. Come to me, and he says, I will give you rest. I know you're exhausted. I know it feels like putting one foot in front of the other right now. It's taking everything in you. I want you to come to me. I want you to experience my grace. You don't have to do anything to earn it, just to live in it, just to sit and rest, to take my yoke, to take my way, to take my teaching, to take my love upon you, to let me to teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and I will find rest for your souls. For my yoke, my way is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. Will you receive God's grace? Will you share God's grace? Somebody asked me not that long ago, they said, well, yeah, but Pastor Ryan, like how much? Like how much grace do I need to extend? And right before that parable that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 18, the disciples asked Jesus the same question. They say, Jesus, how many times do we have to do this? 7? Seems like a good number. And then we could stop. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 70 times. Which is sort of a magical, 70 times 77 times is like a magical recipe equation in the Bible that equates to infinity, essentially. There's no end to this. And so when you're considering, should I show grace or should I not? Choose grace. Just err on the side of grace. The world's got enough shame in it. The world doesn't need another group of people telling them how they're wrong. But instead of a group of people letting them know that there's a God that loves them, that there is a place for them. Here, will you receive that same grace? Will you share it with others? Genesis. We want to be a place of grace for people where they come and they sit with this community and they see something in us that has changed us, that's given us new life, that drives us, that doesn't look like the rest of the world, that is available fully to them, that they might experience the same grace we've experienced in our lives. That's who we want to be. That's the vision that God has given us. Will you own it? Will you with me? Will you own it? Let's pray. God, I just want to start by thanking you. How amazing your grace truly is, God. As broken people, Lord, walking this earth, bound by shame, continuing in this cycle of sin and shame, not feeling like we measure up, not feeling like we're good enough for anybody, anything, certainly not you. You come into our midst as the person of Jesus, and you walk this earth to show us another way. In your grace, you patiently wait for us to come to you and find rest. That in your grace, you sent your son Jesus to the cross to die the death that we deserve for our sin, for our brokenness, God. You say that the wages of sin is death. That was to be our death. And yet Jesus, in his grace and his kindness and his love, he takes that death upon himself. And that 3 days later, after his death, he would rise again, giving us the hope that this grace is fully available to us without question. When we simply place our faith in who he is and what he did, we are filled with grace. And God, I pray that that grace in us would now be the driving force in our lives. That every decision we make, every move that we make in this earth, and who we become, that would all be built upon the foundation of grace. That we, God, that we, your church, and not just our church, but all churches, that we would be known for our grace. We would be known for how we love each other. We would be known for how we love the world. We would be known as a place where people bring their shame and it is broken free because of the grace of God, that we would extend and share the same grace you have given to us, God. So thank you. Thank you for the good news. Allow it to rain upon us this morning. Allow it to shower upon us this morning, that we would walk out of here knowing that there is rest in you, that your way is light, that there is no burden to be bared, but instead that grace is sufficient for all things. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
So great, Ryan. Shame has sort of been the theme of my